Happy Tuesday. It is Tuesday, the 20th day of June, the 171st day of the year, 194 days remaining in the year 2023. And welcome to another edition of Tuesdays with Thom. Our G-List guest today is Andy Hornsby. Andy is a native of Macon County, Alabama, which is where Tuskegee is, which would make that more familiar with it. Aaron Hornsby is a former commissioner of the Alabama Department of Human Resources and former director of the U.S. Food Stamp Program under President Bush #1. Hornsby, a white man, has been involved in the majority Black city of Tuskegee most of his life. His father was Macon County's probate judge and sheriff. His dad was sheriff when George Wallace disrupted the peaceful integration of Macon County schools, causing a major uprising in the community. Hornsby has stories to tell, and we look forward to hearing them. This edition of Tuesdays with Thom, of course, is sponsored by our partners, the Best Girl consulting firm. Best Girl has been providing customized solutions to executive issues for 36 years. So let's hear from Best Girl.
Best Girl is a consulting firm that provides customized leadership, access and inclusion, public relations, communications, and organizational consulting services. Clients include Fortune 500 companies, utilities, higher education institutions, small businesses, and associations. Best Girl's team of consultants, led by Joyce Gilly-Gossam, Emily Hedrick, and Sean Jones, partners with business and education clients to promote organizational effectiveness, communication, motivation, and leadership, with always an impact on the bottom line. Best Girl's customized consulting services include strategic planning, corporate communication, executive coaching, fundraising, and economic development.
Best Girl creates the solution that fits your needs. So let's get to our roundtable regulars and introduce Barbara Wallace Edwards and Michael Walker. Barbara Wallace Edwards is a Mobile, Alabama native. Hey, Barbara, how are you this morning?
Good morning, Thom. I'm doing well, thank you. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Good.
What's happening in your world?
Well, Thom, first I want to give a shout out to Mrs. Opal Lee, who's known as the grandmother of Juneteenth. And that Juneteenth was celebrated as a national holiday on yesterday, and Mrs. Opal Lee was responsible for that becoming a national holiday. She worked for decades trying to get that commemorated as a special day across the country, and was successful in doing so last year when President Biden signed that bill into action. So want to shout out to her. And in addition, Thom, I'm sorry, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to ask you, how did this come about?
Well, she started working on it locally. She said,
what did she do? What did she do?
I don't know her actual background as what her career was, but she had joined the Tarrant County Black Historical and Geological Society, and she oversaw local Juneteenth celebrations there in her community. And over 40 years ago, decided she wanted to do something on a bigger scale. And so in 2016 is when she really started a national campaign to make it a celebration across the country.
Okay.
Yeah. And I also wanted to mention a story that I shared with you all earlier, talked about a little bit earlier, in the city of New Bern, Alabama, which is a Black majority town in rural Alabama. There had never been an election for the mayor and city council. But in 2020, Patrick Braxton ran and became the first Black mayor of the city. With no opponent, he ascended into the office by default. However, the previous mayor, Hayward Woody Stokes, is still serving as mayor, despite the fact that he failed to even submit the paperwork to run. The story is that throughout the years, the position of mayor had just been appointed by whoever the current mayor was. He just picked his white friend to become the next mayor. So here we are in 2023, and they will not give up their office. Mr. Braxton actually won the office in 2020, but he has been locked out of City Hall and hadn't been able to perform his duties. So he's filed a lawsuit, and this is a story I want to continue to follow to see how it all works out. But he's 3 years into his office and still can't perform the duty of mayor.
He's 3 years into his office, but he hadn't been in his office.
Hadn't been in his office, right?
Okay. All right. Did you have a good Father's Day?
It was good, Tom. I spent it with some family friends, and so it was a good day.
All right. Well, let's get Michael on. Good morning, Michael Walker.
Good morning, TG. Thom Gossam Jr. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good, man. I'm doing all right. You?
I'm doing well. Good morning, Barbara. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Great.
So, Michael, what's happening in your world?
Well, there's several things of note. Barbara brought up Juneteenth, the national holiday and celebration yesterday. And, you know, it's interesting talking about Juneteenth, our latest Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson, the Washington Post did a background on her ancestors and her husband's ancestors. Turns out that when Ketanji Brown's great-great-grandfather came into the U.S., he was from Trinidad into Charleston. He was immediately dispatched and enslaved. However, when her husband, Patrick Jackson, 10th great-grandfather came over from the Mayflower, he was given housing and several acres to start. Turns out that her husband's family were all enslavers. And it goes on to say that any young male over the age of 21 was automatically given slaves in the family.
Wow.
And I find that quite interesting that Ketanji Brown, whose ancestors were enslaved, and her husband, Patrick Jackson's ancestors were enslavers, and now they're married. He is a gastrointestinal surgeon now, and she, of course, has been appointed to the United States Supreme Court. Wow. And I don't know who came up with that idea, but I thought it was interesting that the Washington Post dug into that, and they, made public the findings. They talked to her family about it, and, her uncle said, well, that's something that happened 150 years ago, and, neither one of these two people had anything to do with it, and, they found each other and they loved each other, so they move on. But I just find that somewhat ironic that with Juneteenth celebration, and you have these two people, one a Supreme Court justice, the other one is a surgeon, and that's the makeup of their family ancestry. So pretty interesting.
But I think when you dig into history, there's probably several families like that.
Most families probably.
I read a story the other day about Charleston, and where they had a sale of 600 slaves, and they sold like 200 of them in one day, and they would have a description like Old Mary, meaning it was an older lady, which means you couldn't get as much money for her because she couldn't bear children anymore. She wasn't good in the fields, and so on and so forth. So I thought it was interesting. I thought, I don't know how you learn your history if you can't talk about it.
Right.
And let me change that and say, I don't know how you learn the history of this country if you can't talk about it. Which a certain person who's running for president says you can't talk about it.
Right.
So it's an interesting story. Michael, did you have a good Father's Day?
I did. Well, for me, Thom, any holiday that is allows me to have some rest and relaxation without any drama is a good holiday. So there was no drama, no catastrophes. So it was a good day for me. I did get a chance to go to brunch, and I received a call from Michaela out in Arizona and my son Michael, who was here in Atlanta, and we had some good conversation on the telephone. So that was about it for me, but
Good.
it was good. It was enjoyable.
Good deal. That's great, man.
Great.
I'm
Yeah.
glad.
Thom,
How
I'd
was your
like to mention
Father's Day?
something else here that's pretty interesting that's on the news right now. There's a submersible, which is kind of like a submarine. It's called Titan. And it's been missing. It holds about 5 people in a crew. And what this submersible does, it takes people on tours beneath the ocean surface. And this one primarily focuses on the wreckage of the Titanic.
Okay.
And they went out, I guess it was like over the weekend, and they lost contact and communication. Now, this vessel only has 96 hours of oxygen, or say roughly 4 days. And what I find most interesting about this, well, is 2 things, but what I find most interesting, and I heard about this later, is that it's not tied to anything like a submarine has a line or something or a cable to kind of pull it if it gets in trouble.
Yeah.
Well, this particular vessel does not have that. And they just have these little bitty, fans and stuff that it directs it and what have you. And supposedly if it gets into trouble or something like that, it's supposed to become more buoyant and go back to the top of the surface, but it hasn't done that yet. Wow. And so go ahead. What are you going to say?
Now, do they know where it is?
They can't find it.
Oh, wow.
Because they're saying that it should be on top of the water somewhere, but it hasn't risen. And so they're thinking maybe it got snagged in something, which is a problem, or it maybe imploded because there's so much water pressure the deeper you go down. And supposedly it's built to withstand all that. But the thing that I found really I think it's a flaw, but I'm no engineer, but they said even if it comes back up to the top of the water, it can only be open from the outside, not the inside.
Wow.
I shouldn't laugh, but
who designed that?
That's what I don't understand. Why would you get into something that you can't open from the inside? So even if they were to rise, their oxygen is down now by about 30 hours worth of oxygen. So they would have to find them in that vast water and get there quickly to open it up. And the other thing, it costs $250,000 a person to go on this thing.
Wow.
So this is a private thing?
Yes.
Is this private? Yes. It's not government or anything like that?
No. It's a company called Ocean Gate Expeditions is the owner of the craft. And they've been making
people pay $250,000 to get on this. Wow.
Yes. And to go down to view the Titanic wreckage, but again, I have an issue getting into something that I can't open from the inside out.
Yeah, I have an issue paying $250,000 to get on something that I can't open from the inside out.
Well, I agree with that. But I wouldn't pay $250,000 to go down deep in the water anyway. So, but
wow.
So they are really trying to find these people. Like I say, they only have 4 days of oxygen in this vehicle.
Wow, that's incredible. I glanced something about that, but I didn't read it. And, man, that's incredible.
So no one was following them did they have a path that they were supposedly following? No one knows. Wow.
Well, supposedly they're supposed to go right down the area where the Titanic sank. And it's not far from Newfoundland and Boston. Now they have the U.S. Coast Guard involved in the rescue operation, or I should say search and rescue, because they got to find it first before they can kind of even rescue anybody.
I wonder if the Coast Guard has some kind of radar that would detect where things are in the ocean.
You would think.
I don't know.
There's got to be some kind of tracking device on it.
Yeah,
and that's what you guys are alluding to, and I would agree with that. But I don't know if something goes wrong. What can you say? And you're down there in the bottom of the ocean.
That is one guy. I know one person that wouldn't go down there. You know.
I can name probably 3 right here.
Wow.
Yeah, I think that's a trip I pass on.
Yes.
Yeah, I will as well.
Mm.
I know that I'll just mention we had Harvey on here a couple of weeks or so ago, and I think that we've acknowledged that he's passed, and I think there's a service for him. When is that, Barbara?
It's Saturday in Phoenix City.
Okay. For anybody who's interested, it's Saturday in Phoenix City, Alabama, which is where he's from. Okay. You got anything else, Michael?
Yeah, something that may be a little lighthearted, funny. A man exact revenge on a plane passenger recently. Supposedly, or allegedly, a female passenger kept taking her shoes off, sticking her feet under his seat, and he could smell her smelly, sweaty feet, and she wouldn't move them. So he decided to start to pour cold soda on her feet. He would lean over and pour this on her feet. And after about 2 or 3 pours, she removed her feet from under his seat.
Damn, she must have been pretty tall, because
really,
for her feet to come out from under his seat,
right?
Or the seats are real tight, real close. That's funny.
Yes.
I know you have people behind you who or people in front of you, and they'll let that seat back on you.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And supposedly that's what she was doing. She was lounging, so she was stretched out.
Okay. That's interesting.
And I guess sometimes they tell you if you can't put something on the floor in front of you, maybe put it under your seat or something. I don't know, but anyway, she took her shoes off and put her feet under his chair. He didn't like it, so he started pouring cold soda on her feet.
Like Thom said, she must have been really tall for to stick out that far for him to even see that her feet were under his seat.
Well, I guess the smell found it first.
Well, I was going to say you ought to know that your feet smell. So
yes,
great story, man. Okay. Barbara, you got anything else?
No, Thom.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to move on. Let's go to Sean. I think she's got a minute for us.
Good morning to everyone joining in with us. My name is Shantia Jones, and this is Got a Minute. Yesterday was Juneteenth, a day that commemorates African-American freedom and emphasizes education and achievement. It is a day, a week, and in some areas, a month marked with celebrations, guest speakers, picnics, and family gatherings. It is a time for reflection and rejoicing. It is a time for assessment, self-improvement, and planning for the future. Its growing popularity signifies a level of maturity and dignity in America that has long been due. In cities across the country, people of all races, nationalities, and religions are joining hands to truthfully acknowledge a period in our history that shaped and continues to influence our society today. Happy Juneteenth. Now, before I go, here is a final tribute to the men that makes a difference in our lives. Enjoy.
All right, Antley, you sneaked in my picture, I see. Hey. Okay, well, let's go to the G list. Hollywood's got the A list, and here on Tuesdays with Thom, we've got the G list. And our G list guest today is Andy Hornsby. Andy has lived on and around Tuskegee and Macon County most of his life. Whereas if he didn't live there, he was in Montgomery or Washington, D.C. or New York or whatever, but he always stayed connected to Macon County. So we're going to let's get Andy Hornsby on here this morning because he's got some stories to tell. Let me say this, Andy's having issues with his camera, so we won't be able to see him. I could comment on that, but I'm not. But we will be able to communicate and talk to him. Andy, are you still there? Are you out there somewhere?
I'm right here.
How you doing this morning, Andy?
I'm doing great. Glad to be on the show and glad to meet these other fine folks.
What'd you do to that camera?
But listen, technology and me, we just don't go together well. And I was worried about that. I should have got my computer guy over here last night to get it rigged up. And we've tried Zoom and everything. But anyway, you may be better off not having me on camera, Thom. So
we miss seeing your face, Andy.
I'm not going to agree with that, Andy. So, Andy, you got plenty of stories to tell. Where do we start?
Well, I guess I'd probably start with my early background. How I came to be Andy Hornsby was what is perceived by most to be very moderate racial views. And how an old redneck friend of mine asked me one time, how'd you become what you are? And I thought about that, and I was thinking about three things. One was my dad. My dad was the county sheriff and started in 1950. And I grew up in a very racist community of Tuskegee. I mean, we drew the city limits down so we could eliminate black voters, resulting in a boycott in 1957. We eliminated all but 400 black. We had college professors teaching at Tuskegee University who couldn't vote in the city election. And they did that, and it resulted in a boycott that just about ruined the city. But I always say, if people tell me I can't vote, I'm not going to shop with you. So that I saw all of that. I was born in 1943, late 43, and so I was 18, 19 years old when the civil rights movement was going good, and Tuskegee was obviously a very vocal point of that. And Rosa Parks was born in Tuskegee.
I didn't know that.
And and Fred Gray moved there in '64, and things really got going. My sister was a senior in 1963, going into her senior year. I was already at Auburn, and the school system had worked all summer, the student leaders, to peacefully integrate Tuskegee High School. There were 13 black students selected, and I always said they were handpicked. Willie Wyatt told me, he said, they didn't handpick me. He said, I got in there, but Willie is a great friend of mine. Anthony Lee was the named plaintiff, Lee versus Macon. And Fred brought that lawsuit, and so we were well prepared to integrate and everything, but at 6 o'clock that morning, George Wallace sent in more than 200 state troopers, and they surrounded the school. Now, my dad was the chief law enforcement officer of Macon County. He was in charge of law enforcement there. And so he took my sister and said, I'm going to take her to school. And I dared somebody to try to stop me. And he was a big guy, and they let him in, but she couldn't go by herself, very frankly. The teachers lined up behind them and followed them in. The white teachers wanted to teach black kids. They were ready for it. And it was a sad, sad day. Now, Huntsville, Alabama integrated the same day, but Wallace was told in no uncertain terms by leaders in Huntsville, stay out from up here. And he did. And he probably didn't have enough state troopers up there. They had more law enforcement than he did. But that had a profound impact on me. But the first thing was my dad hiring that black deputy, James G. Charity, in 1962. Macon County Sheriff's deputies probably made about $200 a month then, and it was hard to get good qualified people. And my dad heard about a black man out at the VA hospital who was in charge of security, who had been trained by the FBI Academy, no less. So my dad somehow taught. I don't know how he talked him into leaving that good federal job, but he did. And Charity came to work for the Macon County Sheriff's Department. Was immediately popular. At first, it was outrage across the county, but then as they got to know this guy, they called my dad and said, "Send that black deputy up here, Sheriff. He knows how to handle things. He was a good, strong law enforcement officer." And they started calling for him. So it all that got quiet pretty quick. But I was getting criticized. Our house got egged. Somebody threw eggs on the house and the cars, and we were called, you know what, at school. Me and my sisters, and probably had a couple of fist fights. And but I was somewhat critical of my dad for doing that just to go along with my fellow classmates. And my dad called me over to his office one day, and he was a powerful man, and he very rarely ever did that. Wasn't anybody there but he and I. And he sat down and he logically went through why he made that decision. And he said, it is the right decision. And I walked out of there and said, I'll never criticize him again, and I'm proud of him for being courageous and taking that action. So that, and a black woman named Betty Bush, who came to work for us in 1950 and worked for us until I left home. She bathed me and bathed my son. And when you come to love a person like my family loved her, a lot of hate goes out of you. You can't hate a person because of color, simply because you love that person so much. And that happened all over. But Betty Bush was a big part of my developing my progressive racial views. And then going to Auburn. Thom, I was a little ahead of you. I finished in 1968. But I was there the day Harold Franklin integrated. And one of your teammates, I saw something. Harold was in graduate school, if I remember.
Yes.
And he taking some graduate courses. He was walking down toward his first class that morning, and we were all watching. And Ole Miss had just erupted into violence with people losing their lives. The University of Alabama had to stand in the schoolhouse door in Auburn, and something happened that morning that I never forgot. I was outside the student union. And as Harold Franklin approached the class door had not been opened. The people standing outside. A great All-American football player named Bill Van Dyke went over and shook hands with him, stuck his hand out. I think he may have even lit a cigarette. I couldn't be for sure on that. And they walked in together. Well, all of a sudden, everybody melted away. Said, "Oh, that's all right. Van Dyke's all right with it. It's not a problem." And the Plainsman the next day said, "It's just another day at Auburn," was the headline story. And it meant everything happened at all these other schools, but at Auburn, it was just another day. We were integrated. And I know, Thom, I've heard you plenty of times. I know you ran into a lot of racism. But that day, what Van Dyke did, and I was able to tell him, I think he's passed away, I'm not sure. I was able to tell him over Jordan Hale one day that I saw that. He got tears in his eyes when I told him that. And but that's kind of my views and what triggered me being on this show today. My son, who's got the same name as his grandfather and me, he's the third. He found something in the paper recently that, Barbara, I think you got a copy of it, about my dad being hung in effigy by the Ku Klux Klan, along with a black man named Detroit Lee, who is Anthony Lee's father. I had thought for a long time that it was the black deputy that was hung in effigy with him. But that night, I guess I was about 18 or 19. I had a buddy working on the police radio and also an Auburn student, now a big-time lawyer in Birmingham. And he called me, said, "Andy, you need to get up to City Square right now." And I went up there, and the Klan had hung my dad with a noose around his neck and a noose around Detroit Lee's neck. And my dad had a little sheriff's badge on and a little cap pistol around and all that. And I was so upset. I cut it down. And I can't remember if the police had gotten there. I talked to them about it later. But I took it down by Howard Cleaners below the dairy bar and burned it. One of my greatest mistakes ever. I'm on the Tuskegee History Center board now, and we ought to have that effigy hanging in the Tuskegee History Center like it had. I should have saved it, and but I was so upset as a 19-year-old, I wanted to destroy it, but it was the wrong thing to do. And then the last thing I want to mention, the morning after Sammy Young was shot and killed up at the bus station, I was helping my dad at the probate office. This is up to about 1967. My dad had left the sheriff's office, and students and faculty and administrators all marched to the square in Tuskegee. It was a volatile situation, and I slipped out of the my dad's office to listen, and I never had heard "We Shall Overcome" sang by 1,000 people firsthand on the courthouse steps. And it was one of the most moving experiences of my life to hear those. You know, we had a good choral group at Tuskegee University anyway, but boy, we had 1,000 of them who were emotional. And boy, I tell you, after that, I sort of said, okay, here's where I am, and that's Andy Hornsby.
I hear you. So Andy, let's go back to Tuskegee for a minute. And throughout Alabama, particularly in smaller communities, rural areas, you would have majority Black populations, but the whites would still run the government, the town, the business, and everything else. And if in fact the Blacks tried to, you mentioned Mr. Young, or Young, is that how you pronounce it? Young.
Young.
He was shot for trying to use a white bathroom. I guess my question is, how did this go on for so long? When did it start to change, and how did it change, or has it changed?
Well, it certainly changed a lot in towns like Tuskegee. We have, there's probably not 25 white people that live in the city limits, but maybe a few more. But political power, the Voting Rights Act probably did more than the Civil Rights Act to promote integration and equal opportunity. And Tuskegee was unique in that we had a large VA hospital there. We had Black MDs and nurses and administrators, high-level people. And then we had the university with professors. And I remember Dr. Stanley H. Smith failed the voting test, and he had a Harvard PhD in sociology. And I thought, well, I passed that test, and Dr. Smith failed it. So I must be smarter than him, knowing full well that Wallace appointed voter registrars had found a comma out of place somewhere, something he wrote, but with that class of Black folks in Macon County and Tuskegee, the white power structure that existed in the 50s knew if they ever let these Black folks vote, they were going to produce qualified candidates and vote that we'd have mayor, city council, and vote them out of office. And actually, Dr. Charles Gomillion was a big proponent of that and a great leader. There's a book, Gomillion versus Lightfoot. Lightfoot was a white mayor, and it was about the boycott and the voting rights. And so as soon as they got the right to vote and the Federal Voting Rights Act passed and they had to register Blacks, well, Blacks started being elected. And so it started turning around. But there's still, you still couldn't. I found out that I remember one time in Macon County, even though it was 85% Black countywide, we had 4 county commissioners. 2 of them were white. Black people would vote for white candidates if they thought they were better. But white candidates wouldn't vote for a Black candidate, in my view, because of race. But I remember the 2 county commissioners, and they thought they were good, did a good job. They kept them in office.
Okay. Andy, we're probably going to ask you some questions here now. Michael, you got some questions, man?
Well, yeah, and I want to start with this. And Andy, I certainly appreciate you being on board and coming with us. And I'm going to say War Eagle to you being an Auburn grad, and we all here are Auburn grads. But you mentioned something here when Thom asked the question, I was going to ask that. How is it possible with a population or the demographics such as they were at that time that you kept having white people in elected office? And you brought up the Voting Rights Act, and you said that, in your estimation, did more than the Civil Rights Act in order to propel Tuskegee forward to having qualified Black candidates in office. Is that the same Voting Rights Act that Clarence Thomas just voted against and wrote this 48-page dissent against it and saying voting rights should have been gutted? Help me understand this. How can you have a man like Clarence Thomas from South Georgia, that's a Supreme Court judge, and he says Voting Rights Act should have been gutted, but here you say it's the reason why Black people ascended to leadership?
There's no question it's the most important civil rights legislation. LBJ, he did everything he could to push forward voting rights and civil rights, and I always admired him. Although he had a lot of skeletons in his closet, LBJ did a lot for our Black population. Clarence Thomas, Michael, if I could explain him, I'd be on the national TV. You can't explain that. He's I don't know what makes him think how he could live with himself to vote all kinds of positions, everything he's for, I'm against, and I don't understand it. But
go ahead, you guys.
Well, I just the vote. Black people could not vote in Macon County. When I registered to vote, they took me in the back room of the courthouse, and two people slipped in quietly and whispered, "Don't say anything, because we're not supposed to be open. We're just registering white people." They didn't say that. I knew what they were doing. Now, Wallace had appointed two men. I'm not going to say their names because their children are still around and the grandchildren, but they were the biggest racists in Macon County, and they were the electors, the three. But he had Folsom had appointed one whose picture's in the Fred Gray's History Center down in Tuskegee that was a hog farmer in Notasulga. And this man said, "Well, these people are smarter than I am. I'm going to register them to vote." And so he was registering voters pretty fast, and they got him off the Macon County Board of Registrars. There are three registrars, and they put racists on there they just wouldn't open the office. So at one time, we didn't have but 400 Black voters in town. And so no way to elect a Black. And that all changed with the National Voter Rights Act, because the marshals would be there seeing that voting was done properly.
One of the guys I saw said that he failed the test to vote because he couldn't tell them how many bubbles of water were in the ocean. And they said, "Well, you failed."
Well, it was everything. It was horrible the way educated. Now we had a lot of people that weren't that well educated. I have an uncle who could barely read and write, but he knew more about politics than anybody. He should have been allowed to vote, even though he couldn't. He could barely read and write, but he knew he could. It's just ridiculous.
Were you around? And I'm sure you were during that time frame when the Tuskegee syphilis study was outed, so to speak, and became public knowledge.
I was not living in there then. That didn't become public knowledge until the 70s, if I remember right, Thom.
72, something like that.
Yeah. And Fred brought the lawsuit, Fred Gray, and I knew people involved. And Charlie Pollard was the named plaintiff. Mr. Pollard was a great friend of my family's, and it was considered an economic boom. When they didn't produce much money, the lawsuit, I don't think, was but $10 million, was it, to be divided out. But Mr. Pollard said, I knew I had so many kinfolks when they started coming out. But the syphilis study, I was living in Washington, D.C. I paid careful attention to it. I read everything I could on it, but I was not on the scene.
Okay. Yeah, you keep mentioning Mr. Gray. Fred Gray is still a great attorney, still practicing. and he filed a lot of the lawsuits in the state of Alabama for voting rights and to integrate the schools. He was really big on integrating the schools. And you mentioned Harold Franklin. Mr. Gray was the attorney for Harold Franklin. So I just wanted to, some people may not know who you're talking about when you're talking about Mr. Gray. Barbara, you got a question?
I do. I want to start with a comment and thank Andy for joining us this morning and sharing these wonderful stories that he has. But I do have a question for you, Andy. You know, you're living in Montgomery, you've lived in D.C., but you're still heavily involved in Tuskegee and serving on, I know you have served on the board of the trustees for Tuskegee and the historical society there. Why are you still so engraved and involved in the Tuskegee community?
I love Tuskegee. I love everything about it. And my parents lived there until they died and got too old. And finally, we had to move them to assisted living. So Tuskegee has always been my home. I've always been proud of it. I'm proud of all the great people it produced, black and white. We produced a lot. I ride down the Highway 29 South, and I pointed to a brick house and said a man that lived there became president of Yale University, a white guy.
Wow.
And they Howard Lamar Jr. And he just died a few months ago. And Katie Lamar Jackson and her sister's name just left me. They live in Auburn, Michael. You may know those. Their name was Lamar, J. Lamar, and
Okay.
they
I do.
They were great. There were a lot of great people in Tuskegee, but the thing I like about it, I have now my friends are predominantly black that live there. Judge Al Menifee, the retired probate judge, is one of my closest friends, and we talk all the time. And I stay active in politics, although I can't vote there. I'm over there trying to get the right people elected, and so I'm going to stay active as long as I live.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Michael?
My daddy would have done the same too. Let me say, I do a lot of that because of my dad.
Right.
Okay, Andy. You mentioned Charlie Pollard being the lead plaintiff on that case of syphilis. Charlie Pollard and my grandparents were very good friends. As a child, my grandparents used to go down there to visit Charlie Pollard when I was a little kid, and I always wondered what was going on with him because he had an eye that had turned a different color due to the syphilis and had these other things. And I used to ask my grandparents about certain physical features I saw that seemed abnormal, and they ended up telling me. So I kind of grew up understanding all that. And of course, Fred Gray was also friends of my grandparents. So I was right in the middle of all of that. But I wanted to mention or speak with you about, you were involved in the food stamp program under President H.W. Bush, I believe. You administered that.
Right.
And before the food stamps, they used to give out food, government food. And then
commodity food.
I'm sorry?
Commodity food, yes.
Yes. Well, my grandmother was hired by Auburn to go out in the rural community and teach the people that were receiving that food how to prepare it. And that lasted for a while. And then they moved to the food stamp program. And now from the food stamp program, now I see people that go in the grocery store and they have a little card, like a credit card that they use to go and buy food. Tell me about how that changed from the commodity food program to food stamps to where we are now. How did all of that happen?
That's a great question. I interviewed on Auburn's campus with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I was pretty certain I was taking a job with IBM. It was raining the day I had my last interview with IBM, and I didn't have an umbrella, so I was standing looking at waiting on it to start raining, and the placement officer said, "Andy, will you go interview with the man from USDA downstairs?" And I said, I'm going to IBM. I'm not going to work for them. He said, he's been here all day, and this was the height of the Vietnam buildup. If you were healthy and didn't have dependents, you were headed to the military. And so we didn't have a lot of graduates that weren't committed to the military. But I went down and interviewed with this guy. I worked for him for 30 years. The guy was... So I got interested in food programs. And and commodity food program was pretty prevalent in Alabama, and all of that is helping remove surplus. They take milk. The dairy lobby is very successful in making the government buy the unsold milk, and then turn it into non-fat dry milk and butter and cheese and do all that. But that really kills commerce. There's no sales, and it dries up grocery store business. And so we put the food stamp program in 19. One of the first counties was Jefferson, and we put it in another county in Kentucky. And I started a year or two after that. And so I was involved in the expansion of the food stamp program. But those paper food stamps were expensive. It cost $35 million. And I know this because I was the guy who put in that EBT debit card. I did that.
Wow.
And and I was proud of it because it cost so much money to hand out paper food stamps. The bill to burn the food stamps was $6 million so a year. I've always said I could get me a big truck. I know some places in Macon County, I could haul those stamps down there and light a fire and make that $6 million myself. So,
Right.
but the debit card also protect the indignity of taking out these paper food stamps on the grocery line was, and people always, that woman that's got in the Cadillac and she's buying steak for the dog, got those designer jeans on. She was always just ahead of me. Any town I went to traveling around the country, that same woman had been out in there shopping with food stamps, and everybody saw her. And I could never catch her because she was just always just ahead of me. But so I was glad to be instrumental in putting that card in. And actually, the people that gave us the idea were the lottery people from Massachusetts. We had to have a system that could work in a store in a holler in Kentucky that didn't have electricity. But most everybody had a phone by the 70s. And so the lottery folks taught us more or less how to use that debit card. It has progressed since then. It's been highly successful. Less cost, save the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. So that's that history, Michael. I didn't want to go on too long about that, but I was proud of it.
Well, good. Congratulations on that.
When you look back at some of the things that happened, people today say, God, how could that happen? And I say that about Mr. Young, Younge. I guess I'm pronouncing it right. But he tried to use the white-only bathroom at Wilson Service Station and got into a standoff with the night attendant at the service station who had a pistol. Young allegedly had a golf club. A golf club against a pistol just generally doesn't hold up too well. And whether it was on purpose or whether it was by accident, I guess they didn't determine. He shot Young, who fled to the area near the bus station, and when he was found dead the next day. Those kinds of things happened in small towns throughout Alabama. Because I've heard stories about other small towns, and that led to that march that you described, Andy,
Yes.
with the "We Shall Overcome." But just a comment. You can comment on it if you like.
Well, that was a horrible night. The night, I guess it was one of the worst days was the day Mr. Segrist, Marvin Segrist, was the man that shot Sammy, was acquitted when he was found not guilty. That produced really a lot of emotion, and there were stories that Sammy, and James Foreman even covered some of this in his book on Sammy Young. That Sammy was drinking bad heavily, and he'd been home from the Navy and all of that. But to shoot a man who's got a golf club, and the Wilsons claim that, and they're still around, that there were 3 restrooms, women's, men's, and ours, for the help, and that Sammy wanted to use whichever one he wanted to use, and I knew Sam, and he might have been a little aggressive with Mr. Segrist, but he didn't deserve to be shot. Certainly not. And Segrist was guilty. He fired the gun, and the man's dead. So I don't know how you could have quit him.
Yeah, that's interesting. Michael?
Well, I guess I kind of want to go back to that and elaborate a little bit. Based on what I'm hearing, there were 3 restrooms, one for the employees, one for women, one for men. So there was not a restroom for black people then, right?
No, it was the men and women. The restroom was already integrated then. They had.
Oh, the
I tell
restroom was
you,
already integrated. Okay.
Yeah, men or women, whatever race. Now, listen, here's what happened. In those small service stations in Tuskegee, there were 4 restrooms originally: black men, black women, white men, white women. And when the Civil Rights Act passed and they started getting pressure, we had that boycott. If you offended black shoppers in Tuskegee, you were a damn fool, because that was your business. You couldn't have survived without black business. We have enough white people to support a business. And so all at once, the restrooms converted. They made one you typically would make one a storage room. You'd have boxes of oil stored, and then turn the water off and leave it closed up. Then one black, one men, one women, and one staff only. And that's black staff and white staff. And because most of those stations had black staff members. So that was the way the restroom situation had evolved to. See, that was when was Sammy shot? 67?
Yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah.
66.
66. Okay. See, we were in not full integration mode, but we were pretty moving there.
Okay. All right.
No, y'all haven't brought up the Confederate statue. That's been a big issue over there lately, and it's going to be interesting to watch that.
So tell us about it.
Well, right shortly after the turn of the century, the Macon County Commission gave a parcel of land to the Daughters of the Confederacy, United Daughters of Confederacy. And it was to be a park for white people, and they were to erect a memorial to the Confederacy. And they put up the standard old concrete guy standing there with his rifle and facing north, and like so many small towns have. And it's been when the day after Segrist was acquitted in court for killing Sammy Young, the students painted that thing black except for the yellow stripe down his back. And I thought that was pretty unique. But it's been defaced a few times, but by and large, nobody pays much attention to it. We want it moved to the Tuskegee History Center. Fred and I are trying to get them to give it to us, and we'll move it over there to the History Center, put it in the backyard. Johnny Ford said he's going to bury it if you move it over there. He wants it buried. So, but you know, Johnny, he and I grew up playing together now, by the way, down on the city lake. But he's the only guy who could whip me wrestling. And he was, yeah.
Well, since you brought up Johnny, I was going to ask you about him. Was Johnny the first black mayor? And how did he end up getting elected?
Well, I think he was elected in 72, if I'm not mistaken. And he got elected because we had probably a high percentage of black voters. But I suspect Johnny, he had come back to Tuskegee to head the Office of Equal Opportunity, OEO, and the Community Action Agency, and was real well thought of in the community now. And Johnny's been elected mayor 4 times, but he's been defeated 5. So, you know, he can get elected, but he can't stay there. And you know, and I think he's on the city council now, but he's been very active in taking the statue down. A lot of my black friends that are my age and around there don't give a damn about the statue. They don't pay attention to it. But I think the judge has recently ruled the act of the county giving that land to the Daughters of the Confederacy was an illegal act, and the land shall revert to the county. If that happens, then the statue will be moved or taken down or something will go happen to it. And I think people will be happier, except for a few white people. But, got to move on. But
I think the women and their daughters of the Confederacy no longer live in Tuskegee anyway, do they?
we can't find one. I think I know one or two, but they don't want their names used. No, we can't find them. Yeah, but there is an organization, but and the president if they no longer have an active chapter in Macon County, the land is to revert to the county. So they try to say, and they got a pretty good lawyer in Montgomery, who I call him the Confederate lawyer. I've never seen so much. Fred sent me to his office to visit with him one time, try to see if we could get this thing negotiated. I've never seen so much Confederate memorabilia in my life. It was everywhere. It made me nervous. And anyway, but he's a nice fellow. He went to see Fred and said, I want to tour the History Center, and has great respect for Fred as a lawyer, but he is strong on the Confederacy and will fight any action to move that statue. And they got the case under appeal now, Thom and Michael and Barbara. They've appealed it to a higher court. And I don't know if what's going to happen with it, but it will eventually be moved, I believe.
So I got one more thing here. So the integration of the school in Tuskegee, you said that Wallace's action basically set up a big thing of distrust, of divisiveness in the community. So what do you think about some of these laws today? And some of these people who are actually running for office who say things that are very divisive, I find. Matter of fact, one of them I compare him pretty much to Wallace. Any thoughts and comments about that?
Well, the last president was one of the most divisive people that ever would held political office. And these Johnny-come-latelys like DeSantis are just trying to be like him. DeSantis is taking it further. And I think they're despicable. And you mentioned I worked as a political appointee for George H.W. Bush. Now, I was a career merit employee of most of my federal career, but I did take that 2-year appointment in the last of the 2 years of the Bush administration. Now, that's a Republican that I could love, George H.W. Bush. If we had one like him, now we wouldn't have all this divisiveness that you talk about, Thom. But they all out trying to outdo each other. And I'm impressed with Asa Hutchinson. He turned on Trump pretty quick. Chris Christie's done it now, but Lord, these others they want that 30% vote. But he can't get higher than 30%. So he'd be horrible if we put Trump back in there. But he's going to be the nominee, I'm afraid. I don't know. Maybe not.
Michael, Barbara, you got anything else?
I have one other question, Andy. I wanted to ask you about. You remember that log cabin that was down on Highway 29? As a child, I used to go down there to view that. You know the one I'm talking about? As you come into Tuskegee from Auburn on Highway 29, there was a log cabin and a park over there.
Yeah, right on the hill, on the right, on the north side. Yeah.
Whose log cabin was that?
I don't think it's anybody's, Michael. That's Forest Service land, and they wanted to have a place where motorists could pull over and they've got lunch tables out there and all like that, trash cans. I don't think there are restrooms there. And that log cabin was put there probably off the property of the forest land occupied. I don't know any more about that. But I want to mention, I know we got to go, but sometimes if I ever get to do this show again, I hope I get on camera. I'll try to lose some weight between now and then. I'd like to talk a little more about that day in 1963 when the schools were integrated, and especially I, with Dr. Mark Wilson at Auburn, put on a 50-year commemorative in 2013, and we brought back a number of those black kids that could travel and we had Willie White, Anthony Lee, 2 or 3 more, and then a horde of the white kids that would have been their classmates. And there's some of the best stories. I'd love for you to get Willie on with that too. Willie was one of the lead black kids in there, and he talks about they didn't get to graduate. The principal just handed them their diplomas the last day up at Notasulga High School. There were 3 black males graduating. That was a whole class. And so in 2013, the senior class at Notasulga High School invited Willie, Anthony, and the third guy, I can't remember, to come walk with them that night. And Willie had the greatest line, said to Mark Wilson, Dr. Wilson, "You're the only guy I know that could get me up in Notasulga on a Friday night wearing a white cape and a funny white hat." and not be afraid. Anyway, there are a lot of great stories, and how those 2 classes, my sister's class invited all of them to come join them at their luncheon and dinner for the 50th. So for the first time they met each other, and Willie and Judge Pete Johnson from Birmingham. Turns out they were side by side in Vietnam and didn't know it. They were infantry army captains, and just a lot of great stories. And I'm thinking we ought to do something for the 60th and get some of those people back and talk about those days. So I'd like to propose that for the future.
Okay, sounds good. You get that camera fixed so we can see you.
Yes, sir.
All right. Anything else from Barbara, Michael, Andy? Well, we appreciate
I just want to say thank you, Andy, for coming on. We really enjoyed the stories and talking with you, and look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah.
Hey,
Andy,
I
gotta ask you about Thomas Reed's chicken coop.
Yes, sir. It's a great chicken. A lot of this weight around my stomach area right here, Thomas put on me. Actually, it was his Mrs. Reed did. Thomas just handled the cash register, I think. But
well,
we made
many a trip to Tuskegee to go to the coop.
It was good. Had that special seasoning he put on it.
It did. It was.
Yeah.
Okay, Andy, thank you so much, man. We appreciate you, and we look forward to having you back at some point.
Thank you. Nice to meet all of you. And call me if you ever need me. Share my phone number. I keep my cell phone all the time, and I'm available anytime you need me for anything.
All right.
Thank y'all.
Get that
Bye-bye.
camera fixed. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you.
Okay. My closing commentary for today, or as I see it, is, and then he was gone. 3 weeks ago, Harvey Glance was our G-list guest on the show, and it was a wonderful show. We laughed. Harvey was a laugher, and I'm a laugher. We talked and laughed about his many adventures and accomplishments in track and field around the world. And now he's gone. I was not at Auburn when Harvey arrived. I'd graduated, but like many former athletes, I followed him through his many accomplishments. Since we started doing TWT 2.5 years ago, we've had many adventures. We've interviewed many people from around the globe and lived and learned through their adventures. We've learned a lot, such as last week with Eric Simmons and his tale of prostate cancer. Dr. Holly Cost and the OnMed system, a medical advance for the future. Dr. Krista Platt in the diversity building at Illinois State University that the students were allowed to design. We've laughed, we've learned, and we hope to continue to do so. And that's how I see it on this June 20th in the year 2023. That's our show for today. Thank the audience. We appreciate you. Thank our G-list guest, Andy Hornsby. Thank our sponsor, Best Girl Inc. Thank Barbara, Sean, Emily, Joyce, and Michael. And that's it. And for this Tuesday, June 20th, remember to enjoy yourself. Make every day count. Stay safe. Peace.